The parlour of Miss Marple's cottage was precisely as it had been for the past 40 years, with chintz-covered furniture arranged in a manner that suggested comfort rather than fashionability, and it was here that Inspector Graves found himself on the afternoon of the fourth day, having been invited for tea by the elderly woman whom he had initially dismissed as merely another village resident. Miss Marple had poured his tea with the kind of careful attention that suggested she had performed this ritual for countless visitors, and she had waited until he had taken his first sip before mentioning, quite conversationally, that she had been thinking about the manner in which human beings frequently assume that the most obvious solution is necessarily the correct one. The inspector, who was accustomed to elderly women offering opinions about police work, had prepared his polite deflection. But something in Miss Marple's tone suggested that she was not offering unsolicited commentary, but rather attempting to communicate something of genuine significance. She had known Margaret Hartley for 30 years, Miss Marple explained, and while she would not presume to speak to the inspector's professional judgment, she had observed certain patterns in the village that might warrant consideration alongside the more straightforward narrative that was rapidly solidifying around young Christopher's guilt. Inspector Graves had set down his teacup with careful deliberation, recognizing in Miss Marple the particular variety of intelligence that came not from formal training but from lifelong observation of human nature, and he had asked her to continue. Miss Marple had proceeded carefully, laying out her observations with the precision of someone arranging the pieces of a puzzle. She had noticed, she said, that on the afternoon of the garden party, Timothy Ashford had disappeared for nearly 40 minutes, ostensibly to attend to some matter relating to the school, though the school was closed and there was no emergency that anyone could identify. She had observed that when he returned, there was a freshness to his appearance, a sense of having been recently outdoors, and his shoes, though cleaned, bore faint traces of mud that did not correspond to the carefully maintained pathways of the vicarage garden. Most interestingly, she had noted that Diana Ashford's jewellery had changed between the morning and afternoon portions of the party. The distinctive pearl brooch that she had been wearing when Miss Marple had encountered her in the village at 11:30 had been absent when Diana had reappeared at the garden party, and this small detail nagged at Miss Marple with the persistence of something that did not quite align with established truth. The inspector listened without interrupting, and when Miss Marple had finished, he had not dismissed her observations with the condescension that might have been expected. Instead, he had asked about Margaret's relationship with Timothy Ashford, and Miss Marple had revealed what she had learned through careful conversation with the village's various residents. Margaret, it seemed, had discovered that Timothy's credentials, the American doctorate that had impressed the school board and secured his appointment, were fabrications. A relative of hers had connections to American educational institutions, and Margaret had made inquiries that had revealed the truth. Timothy Ashford had purchased his qualifications through a fraudulent service, and he had built his entire position on falsified documentation. Margaret, who possessed a particular rigidity about matters of propriety and authenticity, had been troubled by this discovery and had been considering whether to report it to the school board. The implications of this revelation were substantial. Timothy's entire position, his salary, his reputation in the village, all of it rested upon credentials that were entirely false. Discovery would mean not merely dismissal, but quite possibly legal consequences, the destruction of his career, and the public humiliation of both himself and his wife. Miss Marple observed that Diana, for all her continental sophistication and apparent worldliness, had seemed increasingly anxious in recent days, and one might reasonably speculate that Timothy had confided in her his growing concern about Margaret's knowledge. The inspector had begun to make notes, his expression shifting from skepticism to something more closely resembling professional interest. Miss Marple had continued, carefully, noting that the opportunity for murder had existed not with Christopher Hartley, who had been observed by the neighbour's housemaid at 8:30, arriving at the vicarage precisely as he always did on Tuesday mornings, but rather with Timothy, who possessed knowledge of the vicarage's layout through his wife's social connections and who had ample opportunity during the early morning hours when the vicar was occupied with his pastoral visits. The bread knife, Miss Marple observed, was not a weapon that suggested Christopher's choice. Christopher, who worked occasionally in landscaping and construction, would have had access to tools far more effective than a kitchen implement. But Timothy, who taught in an institution where such weapons were entirely foreign to his daily experience, might well have seized upon whatever came to hand in a moment of desperation or rage. The locked pantry door had initially seemed to incriminate Christopher, but it served equally well to suggest someone attempting to create a false impression of suicide, something that Timothy might have concluded after the deed was done, his panic overriding his judgment. Inspector Graves had risen from his chair, thanked Miss Marple with genuine appreciation, and departed with the air of a man who had pieces of a puzzle that were now beginning to align with disturbing coherence. The following morning, Timothy Ashford was taken into custody following an interview in which he had, under careful questioning, begun to contradict himself regarding his movements on the morning in question. His shoes, retrieved from his home, bore traces of soil that matched the earth near the vicarage, and a witness had come forward, upon police encouragement, to report seeing Timothy near the vicarage at approximately 7:30 on the morning of the murder, carrying something wrapped in cloth. The confession, when it came, was delivered with the kind of emotional exhaustion that suggested a man for whom the deception had become unbearable, and in his statement, Timothy described how Margaret had threatened to expose him, how Diana had begged him to do something, and how in a moment of desperation and fury, he had acted without thought beyond the desperate need to prevent his destruction. Christopher Hartley was released without charge, and the village began the complex process of integrating this new knowledge into its understanding of events, though Miss Marple sat quietly in her cottage, having said nothing to anyone of her role in the investigation's resolution. The village of Thornfield seemed to contract inward following Timothy Ashford's arrest, as though the revelation of such violence within its boundaries had fundamentally altered the spatial relationship between its inhabitants, drawing some closer in shared shock while simultaneously pushing others into defensive isolation. The school board, faced with the embarrassment of having hired a man with fraudulent credentials, convened an emergency meeting in which blame was distributed with a careful precision of those more concerned with protecting their own judgment than with addressing the actual circumstances that had enabled such deception. Dr. Pemberton, who chaired the board, made a statement to the local newspaper emphasizing the sophistication of the forged documents and the manner in which Timothy had deceived not merely the board but also the parents of the school's students, as though this collective victimhood somehow ameliorated the board's failure to conduct adequate verification. Diana Ashford, once the murder had been attributed to her husband, became a figure of profound ambiguity in village perception. She was simultaneously victim and accomplice, a woman whose marriage had been built upon lies, and who had apparently known or suspected the truth regarding her husband's credentials before Margaret had discovered them. The question of what Diana had known, and when she had known, it became the subject of considerable speculation in the village's various gathering places, though Diana herself had retreated into a silence that admitted of no easy interpretation. She had retained Gerald Whitmore as her solicitor, which some perceived as a calculated move to protect her interests, should Timothy's legal situation have implications for her own position, and others regarded as a simple pragmatic response to circumstances beyond her control. She was observed leaving the vicarage with a small suitcase on the morning following Timothy's arrest, and it was widely assumed, though never confirmed, that she had departed the village entirely, returning perhaps to whatever continental existence had preceded her marriage to the village schoolmaster. Christopher Hartley, liberated from suspicion though scarred by the accuser, moved through the village with an air of melancholy resignation. The affair that he had conducted with Diana, which had seemed scandalous when obscured by the shadow of his mother's murder, now appeared almost quaint in comparison to the larger dramas that had been unfolding beneath the surface of village life. He did not attempt to defend himself or to minimize his conduct, and there was a dignity in his acceptance of judgment that seemed to surprise those who had been most quick to condemn him. He remained in Thornfield, though his future there seemed uncertain, and it was observed that he spent considerable time in the library and in long walks through the countryside, as though attempting to process both his own culpability and his narrow escape from a far more serious accusation. The vicar, Reverend John Hartley, aged visibly in the days following the revelation of his wife's murder and his son's infidelity. He delivered his Sunday sermons with the automatic quality of a man reciting prayers rather than preaching doctrine, and his congregation, while maintaining its attendance, seemed to regard him with a mixture of pity and discomfort. The assumption that he had been ignorant of his son's affair and his wife's knowledge of Timothy's fraudulent credentials appeared to be correct, yet this ignorance, rather than protecting his dignity, somehow diminished it. He had been so thoroughly absent from the complex dramas unfolding within and around his own household that his position as spiritual leader of the village seemed precarious. It was whispered that he might resign, that his authority had been irreparably compromised, though he gave no indication of such intention and maintained his duties with the mechanical consistency of habit. Miss Marple, in the week following Timothy's arrest, had received several visitors, though she gave no indication of the role he had played in directing the inspector's investigation toward the correct conclusion. Mrs. Pemberton had called to express her gratitude for the village having been spared the horror of an injustice, though she did not explicitly acknowledge that Miss Marple had been instrumental in preventing such an outcome. Dr. Pemberton had visited briefly, ostensibly to inquire about Miss Marple's health, but actually, Miss Marple perceived, to satisfy himself that she had not revealed to anyone his own minor indiscretion, a matter which he had divulged to Margaret in confidence some months prior and which had caused him considerable anxiety when Margaret's knowledge of secrets had become apparent. The Blackwell twins had invited her to tea and had spent 3 hours attempting to extract from her, through increasingly transparent questions, the exact details of her observations during the garden party and her subsequent communications with Inspector Graves. Miss Marple had deflected their inquiries with the gentle firmness of long practice, offering bland observations about how one simply noticed things and how the inspector was surely the best judge of what was and was not significant. She maintained her composure and her discretion with the kind of certainty that came from understanding that revelation of her methods would only complicate matters, and that the village's need to believe that justice had been served was far more important than anyone's need to understand precisely how that justice had been determined. What Miss Marple did allow herself, in the privacy of her cottage, was a degree of reflection upon the nature of human deception and the manner in which people frequently constructed elaborate justifications for their conduct, while remaining fundamentally unaware of the patterns of behavior that betrayed their true nature. Timothy had believed himself justified in his fraudulence because he had been denied access to authentic credentials through legitimate means, and he had believed himself justified in his murder because Margaret had threatened to expose him. Yet both justifications rested upon a foundation of cowardice and an unwillingness to accept the consequences of his own failures. Diana had sought to distance herself from her husband's crimes while apparently complicit in his self-deception, and the village had sought to maintain its illusion of safety and moral coherence while harboring violence and deception beneath its carefully maintained surface. Miss Marple settled into her cottage with her knitting, the needles clicking with the familiar rhythm of decades, and she allowed herself a small, sad smile at the reflection that human nature, for all its infinite variety, followed patterns as predictable as the seasons. The trial of Timothy Ashford consumed the village's attention for the better part of a month, though the proceedings themselves were conducted in the county town some 15 miles distant, forcing those who wished to observe the unfolding of justice to undertake the journey by car or train. The case, as presented by the Crown, was methodical and devastating in its simplicity. Timothy had murdered Margaret Hartley to prevent the exposure of his fraudulent credentials. He had done so with premeditation sufficient to clean the murder weapon and secure the pantry door, and he had done so despite the availability of alternative solutions to his predicament. His defense counsel argued mitigating circumstances rooted in his desperation and in the suggestion that Margaret's discovery of his deception had precipitated a psychological crisis that had diminished his capacity for rational decision-making. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty, and Timothy Ashford was sentenced to imprisonment, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 15 years before being considered for parole. The verdict was reported in the village with a sense of resolution that was only partially satisfied, for while justice had been served in the formal sense, questions remained about the circumstances that had enabled such deception in the first place, and about the warning signs that various parties might have perceived but had failed to act upon. Inspector Graves visited Miss Marple once more, this time bringing with him a sense of professional closure that was tempered by genuine curiosity about the mechanisms by which she had arrived at her conclusions. He sat in her parlor, accepting a cup of tea, and he asked her directly how she had known that Timothy was guilty when all the evidence had pointed toward Christopher. Miss Marple had considered the question with the careful attention of someone who understood that her answer would carry implications for how the inspector regarded his own profession and his own analytical methods. She had not known, she explained, that Timothy was guilty. She had known only that the obvious suspect frequently was not the guilty party, and she had observed certain details that suggested alternative possibilities. The pearl brooch, she said, had caught her attention because Diana had worn it that morning with the kind of casual certainty that suggested it was part of her regular routine, yet it had been absent in the afternoon. Such inconsistencies often indicated anxiety or a change in circumstances. The mud on Timothy's shoes and his unexplained absence had seemed to indicate his presence in the vicinity of the vicarage, at a time when access would have been possible. But beyond these external observations, she had perceived in Timothy's demeanor during the garden party a particular quality of desperation masked by forced sociability, a brittleness beneath his attempts at pleasant conversation that suggested a man carrying a burden that might at any moment become insupportable. The inspector had listened to this explanation with the expression of someone hearing a language he recognized but did not fully speak, and when he departed, it was with a new appreciation for the limitations of forensic analysis and the degree to which human psychology remained the most essential tool in the investigation of crime. In the weeks following the trial, Thornfield Village began the complex process of attempting to return to normalcy, though the concept of normalcy itself had been fundamentally altered by the revelation of such violence and deception within its boundaries. The school board appointed a new headmaster, a man of 58 with credentials so thoroughly verified and conventional that his appointment seemed almost aggressively safe. Christopher Hartley eventually departed the village, having accepted a position with a construction firm in a neighboring county, and while no one acknowledged his departure as anything other than a natural career progression, there was a collective awareness that he was removing himself from a context in which he would forever be associated with scandal and suspicion. Reverend Hartley continued his ministry with the diminished authority of a man whose command of his own household had proven illusory, though his congregation maintained its respect for him, recognizing perhaps that his suffering was punishment sufficient for whatever blindness he had demonstrated regarding his wife's knowledge and his son's conduct. The vicarage itself seemed to contract around the vicar, becoming less a symbol of moral authority and more simply a place where an elderly man went through the motions of his profession. The Women's Institute eventually resumed its meetings, though. They were moved from the vicarage to the parish hall, a shift that was presented as practical but which everyone understood as a subtle form of rejection. Miss Marple received, on a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th week following the trial, a visitor whom she had not anticipated. Gerald Whitmore, the solicitor, arrived at her cottage, bearing a small package wrapped in brown paper, and he explained, with a combination of gratitude and anxiety, that he had been asked by Diana Ashford to deliver it to Miss Marple should circumstances ever permit. Diana had departed the village several weeks prior and had settled in London, where she was apparently attempting to rebuild her life in the aftermath of her husband's conviction and her own tainted association with the events that had led to Margaret's death. The package, when opened, contained a letter and the pearl brooch that had caught Miss Marple's attention at the garden party. The letter, written in Diana's elegant hand, expressed her understanding that Miss Marple had played some role in Timothy's conviction, and while Diana did not explicitly acknowledge complicity in any crime, she indicated that she was aware of Miss Marple's discretion and that she wished to express her gratitude for the manner in which justice had been served without unnecessary additional harm to those who had already suffered sufficient consequences. The brooch, Diana explained, had belonged to her mother and held sentimental value that she could no longer bear to carry in the village, where it would forever be associated with tragedy. She hoped that Miss Marple would accept it as a token of her appreciation. Miss Marple, who received few gifts and who had long since ceased to expect gratitude for her interventions in the affairs of others, accepted the brooch with a gracious acknowledgment and placed it carefully in a small box on her mantelpiece, where it caught the afternoon light with the kind of quiet beauty that required no explanation or justification. The autumn following Margaret Hartley's murder brought with it the kind of crisp clarity that made Thornfield stone cottages and village streets appear newly defined, as though the season itself was attempting to wash away the moral ambiguities that had accumulated during the preceding months. The leaves turned in their prescribed sequence. The harvest was gathered with the ritualistic punctuality of agricultural communities, and the social calendar resumed its customary progression of events and gatherings, each one proceeding with a kind of careful normalcy that suggested a collective agreement to move forward rather than to process what had occurred. Miss Marple observed these gradual shifts with her characteristic patience, noting how human communities possessed a remarkable capacity for compartmentalization, how they could simultaneously hold profound shock and return to routine with a facility that would have seemed impossible during the immediate aftermath of crisis. It was during this period of apparent restoration that Miss Marple began to perceive certain undercurrents in the village's social fabric that suggested the matter of Margaret's murder and Timothy's conviction had not been resolved as completely as the official verdict might indicate. Dr. Pemberton, in particular, exhibited a nervousness that seemed to exceed what one might expect from a man whose village had experienced a murder. He called upon Miss Marple one afternoon in October, ostensibly to inquire about her health following a slight cold that had briefly confined her to bed, but in reality, Miss Marple perceived to satisfy himself regarding what she might or might not have communicated to the authorities about his own minor indiscretions. He lingered in her parlor beyond the duration required for social courtesy, circling conversations with the wariness of a man attempting to determine the boundaries of dangerous territory. Miss Marple, with her characteristic gentleness, provided him with sufficient reassurance to calm his anxiety without ever explicitly confirming the discretion he sought, understanding that the doctor required the discomfort of uncertainty as much as he required the eventual reassurance that his secrets remained secure. A more substantial disturbance emerged in mid-October, when news arrived from London that Diana Ashford had taken her own life through an overdose of sleeping tablets, discovered in her rented flat by a neighbor who had become concerned by her prolonged absence. The report, when it appeared in the national newspapers, was presented as a tragic consequence of her inability to bear the social ostracism that had followed her husband's conviction, though Miss Marple found herself reading between the lines of the official narrative with the kind of careful attention that the public reports themselves did not warrant. The timing of Diana's death, occurring nearly 3 months after Timothy's conviction, suggested that her despair had been neither immediate nor impulsive, but rather the culmination of a gradually deepening awareness of her isolation and her complicity, however tangential, in the events that had destroyed her marriage and her position in the village. The vicar, when he learned of Diana's death, wept in his study for several hours, a display of emotion that surprised those who had observed his careful emotional restraint throughout the preceding months. Christopher, who heard the news through a telephone call from his father, travelled back to Thornfield for a single day, during which he visited Diana's former residence and stood for a considerable length of time in the garden, staring toward the distant hills with an expression that suggested he was attempting to reconcile the image of the woman he had known with the despair that had apparently consumed her in the aftermath of her husband's imprisonment. The village received news of Diana's death with a kind of stunned silence that was different in quality from the shocked reactions to Margaret's murder. This was a death that seemed to belong to the psychological and emotional consequences of violence rather than to violence itself, and it created a sense of moral unease that manifested in increasingly bitter arguments about responsibility and culpability. Mrs. Blackwell suggested publicly that Margaret, had she been less rigid in her moral judgments, might have exercised mercy toward Timothy rather than pursuing exposure, thereby potentially preventing both the murder and the subsequent suicide. Others countered that Margaret had merely done what was right and proper, that Timothy's deception had been his own responsibility, and that the consequences of his actions should not be attributed to the woman he had murdered. These arguments, while ostensibly about abstract principles of morality and justice, carried within them a current of anxiety about the village's own collective responsibility for the circumstances that had enabled such tragedy. Miss Marple, in the weeks following Diana's death, found herself engaged in an unusual degree of reflection about the nature of moral complexity and the manner in which justice, when achieved through the legal system, often obscured rather than clarified the deeper ethical questions that had precipitated crime. Timothy had murdered Margaret, and this fact was both legally and factually incontrovertible, yet the circumstances that had led to that murder involved Margaret's discovery of Timothy's deception, Diana's participation in Timothy's self-deception, the school bore, Dee's failure to verify credentials adequately, and the village's collective creation of an environment in which such deception had seemed survivable until the point at which it was not. Diana's suicide added a further layer of moral complexity, suggesting that the consequences of Timothy's crime extended far beyond the obvious victim and implicated in the tragedy a woman who had not committed murder, but who had been destroyed by the consequences of someone else's violent act. One evening in late October, as Miss Marple sat in her parlor with her knitting, she found herself considering the possibility that the true measure of human tragedy lay not in the violent acts themselves, but in the accumulated weight of deception, cowardice, and moral compromise that preceded them. She thought of Margaret, whose rigidity and judgment had precipitated her own murder, and of Diana, whose complicity in her husband's deception had ultimately consumed her, and of Timothy, whose fraudulent credentials had seemed like such a small compromise until that compromise had demanded murder as the price of its continuation. And she thought of Christopher, whose affair with Diana now carried the terrible weight of having been part of the chain of events that had led to his mother's death and Diana's suicide, a causal relationship that no court could establish, but which was nonetheless incontrovertibly present in the network of human connection and consequence that linked them all together. The winter of that year descended upon Thornfield with an unusual severity, bringing with it snow that persisted longer than was customary, and a cold that seemed to penetrate not merely the physical structures of the village, but also the psychological atmosphere that had settled over its inhabitants following Diana's suicide. The Christmas season, typically a time of renewed community cohesion, instead became an occasion marked by subdued observance and a collective desire to move through the holiday period with minimal social interaction. The church services were attended with dutiful regularity, but without the warmth that had previously characterized the village's celebration of religious occasions, and the traditional Boxing Day gathering at the Pembertons' home was curtailed by Dr. Pemberton, who cited his wife's persistent ill health as the reason for declining to host the annual event. It was in this atmosphere of diminished social connection that Miss Marple received a visitor who had proved to alter her understanding of the events that had unfolded in Thornfield with a completeness that suggested she had been examining a landscape illuminated by insufficient light. The visitor was Inspector Graves, arriving on a bitterly cold afternoon in early December bearing news that initially seemed tangential to the case of Margaret Hartley's murder, but which, upon closer examination, revealed itself to possess considerable significance. Timothy Ashford, in his prison cell, had submitted a petition requesting a review of his conviction based upon what he claimed was newly discovered evidence that would exonerate him of the murder charge. The petition had initially been regarded as the expected outcome of a man unable to accept the consequences of his crime, but Inspector Graves, in the course of his routine oversight of such matters, had discovered that certain aspects of the case warranted reconsideration. He had come to Miss Marple because he suspected that she possessed knowledge that the official investigation had not fully captured, and because he believed that, if anyone could navigate the moral complexities of what he had begun to perceive as a potentially miscarried justice, it would be she. The evidence that had prompted Timothy's petition concerned the manner in which the bread knife had been handled following the murder. The knife bore Timothy's fingerprints, which had been expected given that he had lived in the village and had likely handled kitchen implements on previous occasions. However, a more detailed forensic examination, conducted at Timothy's insistence through his appeal counsel, had revealed that the fingerprints were not fresh, but rather appeared to have been deposited weeks or even months prior to the murder. Moreover, there were other fingerprints on the knife that had not been fully analyzed during the initial investigation because they were partial and incomplete, yet which, when subjected to more sophisticated examination, appeared to belong to someone else entirely. Inspector Graves had begun to suspect that the knife might have been deliberately handled by Timothy at some point in the past, and that someone else had wielded it during the actual commission of the murder, having taken care to wear gloves or to avoid leaving identifiable prints. Miss Marple listened to this revelation with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was examining the implications of this new information against her own recollections and observations. She asked the inspector several questions about the manner in which the knife had been stored, about whether anyone had access to it, and about the precise timeline of events on the morning of the murder. When Inspector Graves had provided his answers, Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered garden with an expression that suggested she was contemplating something that extended far beyond the immediate question of Timothy's guilt or innocence. She turned back to the inspector after several minutes of silence and informed him that she believed she had made a grave error in her initial assessment of the situation, an error that had resulted in the conviction of an innocent man and that had, quite possibly, resulted in the death of Diana Ashford. The inspector sat forward in his chair, his professional composure momentarily disrupted by surprise at this confession. Miss Marple explained that she had observed certain details at the garden party and in the days following the murder that had seemed to point toward Timothy's guilt, but that in her focus upon those details, she had failed to consider alternative explanations for their presence. She had allowed her initial intuition regarding Timothy's desperation to override her customary caution regarding the drawing of conclusions without adequate evidence. She had, in short, committed the very error that she had observed so many others commit. She had allowed the evidence to be shaped by her preconceived conclusion rather than allowing the conclusion to emerge naturally from the evidence. The inspector asked her directly who she now believed had committed the murder, and Miss Marple responded that she believed the answer lay not in examining who had the motive and opportunity, but rather in examining who had possessed the motive and opportunity to ensure that Timothy Ashford appeared to have committed the murder. This distinction, she explained, required a reconsideration of the relationships between the various parties involved and a recognition that human behavior frequently involved layers of deception far more complex than the simple desire to conceal a single crime. She suggested that the inspector conduct a new investigation, focusing upon Christopher Hartley's movements on the morning of the murder, and particularly upon whether his claim to have been observed by a neighbor might require verification. She suggested also that he examine with particular care the relationship between Christopher and his mother in the months preceding her death, and whether there existed any evidence that Margaret had discovered something about her son that had motivated her to consider action that would have resulted in significant consequences for him. The inspector departed from Miss Marple's cottage with an expression that suggested he was simultaneously grateful for this new perspective and deeply troubled by the implications of what she had suggested. Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting, but her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and she allowed herself to acknowledge, in the privacy of her own thoughts, that the weight of her initial error had settled upon her with a force that all her years of observational wisdom seemed inadequate to bear. The renewed investigation into Margaret Hartley's murder proceeded with a deliberation that contrasted sharply with the rapid conclusion of the initial inquiry, and Inspector Graves found himself re-examining evidence and conducting interviews that seemed, upon cursory examination, to have already been thoroughly completed. The neighbour who had reported observing Christopher Hartley arriving at the vicarage at 8:30 on the morning of the murder was a Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, a widow of 71 who lived in the cottage immediately adjacent to the vicarage and whose testimony had seemed unassailable in its clarity and directness. When Inspector Graves visited her a second time, approaching his questions with a particular gentleness that suggested he understood he was asking her to reconsider her own memory and perception, Mrs. Hutchins gradually acknowledged that her observation of Christopher had not been direct but rather inferred from the sound of the vicarage gate opening at approximately the time she had heard him arrive on other mornings. She had been occupied with her own breakfast preparation and had not actually observed Christopher Durr. Ectley, though the sequence of sounds had seemed consistent with his typical arrival. Under further questioning, she admitted that it was entirely possible that the gate had been opened by someone else, and that she had simply assumed it to be Christopher, because that assumption had seemed the most natural interpretation of the sounds she had heard. This single piece of testimony, which had seemed to place Christopher at a specific time and location on the morning of the murder, thus dissolved into uncertainty and supposition. Simultaneously, Inspector Graves initiated a more detailed examination of Christopher's relationship with his mother in the months preceding her death. He interviewed staff at the construction firm, where Christopher had subsequently taken employment, and learned that Christopher had been absent from work on several occasions in the weeks before the murder, occasions for which he had provided no explanation and for which no corroborating evidence of alternative activity had been offered. He re-interviewed the vicar, approaching the question of his son's conduct with a directness that seemed to require the elderly clergyman to confront truths he had previously avoided. Reverend Hartley, under this persistent questioning, eventually revealed that Margaret had discovered something troubling about Christopher, something that had caused her considerable distress, and that had motivated her to discuss with the vicar the possibility of confronting their son directly. The vicar had been reluctant to discuss the matter fully, but under the inspector's persistent questioning, he acknowledged that Margaret had discovered evidence suggesting that Christopher had been involved in fraudulent financial dealings related to a property development scheme in London. Christopher had apparently misrepresented his qualifications and his experience to secure investment fro. Several individuals, and when the scheme had collapsed, considerable sums had been lost by people who had trusted his representations. Margaret had learned of this through a family connection and had been considering whether to encourage Christopher to make restitution or to report the matter to the authorities. She had not yet reached a decision, but the tension within the household had been considerable as she contemplated the implications of her knowledge. This revelation shifted the entire architecture of motive and consequence. Christopher had not merely been conducting an affair with Diana Ashford, an indiscretion that, while troubling, would have been manageable within the context of village life. He had also been engaged in financial fraud that had caused real harm to innocent people and that, if exposed, would have destroyed his reputation, and quite possibly resulted in legal consequences far more serious than social ostracism. Margaret, who possessed her own particular moral rigidity regarding matters of honesty and propriety, had been positioned to expose her own son to consequences that would have been devastating. The question of what Christopher might have done to prevent such exposure began to assume a central position in the inspector's revised understanding of the case. Miss Marple, when Inspector Graves visited her to discuss these new findings, listened with the expression of someone hearing confirmation of suspicions she had harbored but had hoped might prove unfounded. She acknowledged that she had observed tension between Margaret and Christopher at the garden party, a tension that she had initially attributed to Margaret's disapproval of his affair with Diana, but which might equally have reflected her knowledge of his financial misconduct and her internal conflict regarding what action she should take. She had not investigated this possibility thoroughly, she admitted, because she had allowed the more obvious narrative of Timothy's guilt to preclude such investigation. The inspector asked her directly whether she believed Christopher had murdered his mother, and Miss Marple responded that she believed the evidence now pointed in that direction, though she cautioned that evidence pointing toward guilt and guilt itself were not identical concepts. She suggested that the inspector examine the precise manner in which the pantry door had been locked, and whether Christopher might have possessed knowledge of how to accomplish this without leaving obvious traces. She suggested also that he investigate whether Christopher had actually been in London during the period when the fraudulent scheme had been conducted, or whether he had merely represented himself as being present to distant investors. When the inspector departed, Miss Marple found herself confronting a discomfort that transcended her concern regarding the error in her initial assessment. She had, through her intervention with the inspector in the weeks following Margaret's murder, been instrumental in securing the conviction of a man who now appeared to have been innocent of the crime for which he had been imprisoned. Timothy Ashford was serving a 15-year sentence for a murder he had not committed, while Christopher Hartley, who appeared increasingly likely to have been the actual perpetrator, had lived in relative freedom for months following the crime, his guilt obscured by the convenient narrative that had attached itself to Timothy. Diana Ashford had taken her own life, apparently driven to despair by her husband's conviction and the social ostracism that had followed, when she had not been complicit in Timothy's crime at all, but rather had been a victim of Christopher's manipulation and his willingness to allow another man to be convicted for his own violent act. The weight of these realizations pressed upon Miss Marple with a force that she had not experienced in decades of observational work, and she recognized with painful clarity that her intervention, undertaken with the conviction that she was serving justice, had instead resulted in profound injustice and in the destruction of lives that ought to have remained untouched by such tragedy. Christopher Hartley's arrest came on a grey December afternoon, executed with a quietness that seemed almost apologetic in its restraint, as though the constables who arrived at his place of employment understood that. They were apprehending a man whose crime, while genuine, carried within it a complexity of motivation that transcended the simple categories of guilt and innocence through which the law was compelled to operate. He was brought to the police station for questioning, and over the course of 18 hours, the inspector methodically dismantled the carefully constructed narrative that Christopher had maintained for the preceding months. The evidence was circumstantial in many respects, yet when assembled together it possessed a coherence that left little room for alternative interpretation. Christopher's fingerprints, when compared against the partial prints discovered on the bread knife during the more sophisticated forensic examination, matched those that had been deemed too incomplete for identification during the initial investigation. The neighbor's testimony regarding his arrival at the vicarage dissolved under scrutiny into the supposition and inference that it had always been, leaving open the possibility that Christopher had been present at the house at a considerably earlier hour than had been established. Most damaging was the evidence of Christopher's financial fraud, which provided an irrefutable motive for preventing his mother's exposure of his misconduct. Christopher eventually confessed, though his confession carried within it a quality of self-justification that suggested he had spent the preceding months constructing a narrative in which his mother's death was not murder, but rather an inevitable consequence of circumstances beyond his control. He had not intended to kill her, he maintained. He had intended only to confront her, to persuade her not to expose his involvement in the fraudulent scheme, to convince her that reporting him would do no good and would only destroy the family further. But Margaret had been immovable in her conviction that honesty and accountability were necessary, that his victims deserved restitution, and that his actions could not be excused or minimized. In his desperation and rage at her refusal to accept his reasoning, he had seized the bread knife and had acted without conscious deliberation, driven by a panic that had overridden his capacity for rational thought. What followed had been equally spontaneous. Realizing what he had done, he had attempted to create the appearance of suicide by locking the pantry door from the inside and leaving the key on the shelf. It was only later that he had perceived the potential benefit of Timothy Ashford's presence in the vicinity, the convenient narrative that Timothy's desperation regarding Margaret's knowledge of his fraudulent credentials might provide, and the manner in which he might have deliberately handled the knife on previous occasions to leave his fingerprints in a location where they would seem innocent and inconsequential. He had not consciously orchestrated Timothy's conviction, he insisted, but neither had he made any effort to prevent it, and he had remained silent while an innocent man had been imprisoned for his own violent act. The confession brought with it a kind of terrible clarity that made the preceding months of investigation and injustice seem simultaneously obvious and incomprehensible. Christopher Hartley would face trial for murder, and the evidence now seemed sufficient to secure a conviction that would stand without question. Yet the revelation of his guilt carried within it an implicit acknowledgment of the manner in which the initial investigation had been misdirected, an acknowledgment that fell most heavily upon Miss Marple, though she bore responsibility for this misdirection no more fully than did the inspector himself, who had accepted her reasoning without subjecting it to the scrutiny that professional skeptic ism ought to have demanded. It was Miss Marple who requested a private meeting with Christopher prior to his trial, a request that the inspector initially regarded as unusual but ultimately permitted, recognizing perhaps that Miss Marple's understanding of human motivation extended into territories that official investigation could not adequately traverse. She visited him in the police holding cell, a small room that seemed to shrink around the weight of the crime and the confession that had been extracted from him, and she regarded him with an expression that combined judgment and a kind of sorrowful understanding. She asked him directly why he had allowed Timothy Ashford to be convicted when he possessed knowledge that would have exonerated him, and Christopher's response carried within it the defensive posture of a man attempting to justify conduct that admitted of no adequate justification. He had been afraid, he said, afraid of the consequences that would follow if he confessed, afraid of the destruction that would be visited upon his family, afraid of the loss of the final threads of dignity that might remain to him if he admitted to what he had done. Timothy Ashford had already been convicted on evidence that seemed sufficient, and confessing would not restore Timothy to freedom but would merely add his own destruction to the destruction that had already occurred. This reasoning, Miss Marple observed quietly, represented a form of moral cowardice that transcended simple self-interest and entered into a territory of ethical corruption that was perhaps more troubling than the violence of the murder itself. Christopher had possessed the power to prevent an injustice and had chosen not to exercise it, not because he had been compelled to remain silent, but because his own discomfort and fear had seemed to him more important than the freedom and reputation of an innocent man. He had constructed a narrative in which Timothy's conviction was not his responsibility, in which his silence was not complicity, and in which the suffering that had followed from Timothy's imprisonment and Diana's subsequent suicide were consequences for which he bore no particular accountability. This conversation, brief though it was, seemed to penetrate deeper into Christopher's understanding of himself than the 18 hours of police interrogation had managed to accomplish. And when Miss Marple departed, she left behind a young man whose self-regard had been fundamentally altered by the unflinching recognition of what his conduct had revealed about his own character. She returned to her cottage in the lengthening darkness of the December afternoon, and she permitted herself the acknowledgment that the pursuit of truth and justice, undertaken with the best intentions and the most careful observation, sometimes illuminated not clarity but rather an abyss of human failing that extended far deeper than surface appearances would suggest. The trial of Christopher Hartley proceeded through the winter months with a grim inevitability that seemed to acknowledge that the outcome was predetermined, that the machinery of justice, once set in motion, required only the passage of time to reach its inevitable conclusion. The evidence was presented with meticulous care by the Crown's counsel, who seemed almost reluctant to exploit the sympathetic aspects of Christopher's confession, recognizing perhaps that a young man who had allowed an innocent man to be imprisoned for his own crime had forfeited any claim to the jury's compassion. Christopher's defense counsel mounted the expected arguments regarding diminished capacity and the psychological distress that had precipitated the murder, but these arguments seemed to ring hollow in the face of Christopher's subsequent, deliberate silence regarding Timothy's innocence, a silence that no psychological explanation could adequately justify. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty, and Christopher Hartley received a sentence of life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years before being considered for parole. The verdict was received by the village with an emotion that was far more complex than the simple relief that had followed Timothy's conviction. This was not merely the confirmation that a murderer had been apprehended and justice had been served, but rather a painful acknowledgement that the pursuit of justice had consumed an innocent man's freedom and had contributed to the death of a woman who had been complicit in no crime. The legal system, it seemed, had operated with a kind of tragic momentum that had been set in motion by Miss Marple's initial intervention with the inspector, an intervention that had been undertaken with the conviction that she was serving truth, but which had instead resulted in a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond the single fact of Margaret Hartley's death. Timothy Ashford's conviction was formally overturned in February, following the submission of appeal evidence that rendered his guilt incompatible with Christopher's confession and the forensic findings that now supported it. The manner of his release was quiet, and without the ceremonial acknowledgement of injustice that one might have expected to accompany the exoneration of a man who had served nearly 9 months in prison for a crime he had not committed. He departed the region within a week of his release, and it was learned subsequently that he had secured employment in a distant county, moving with his life into a geography that bore no connection to Thornfield or to the events that had destroyed his reputation and his marriage. No compensation was offered by the authorities, though it was understood that his legal counsel had initiated discussions regarding the possibility of civil action against the Crown for wrongful imprisonment. His departure from the region seemed to symbolize a kind of erasure, a return to anonymity after having been subjected to the intense scrutiny of criminal investigation and public judgment. The village received news of his release with an emotion that combined guilt and a desire to move forward without dwelling upon the uncomfortable implications of what had transpired. Reverend Hartley, confronted with the knowledge that his son had committed murder and had allowed an innocent man to be imprisoned, seemed to age a decade in the weeks following the trial. He submitted his resignation as vicar in March, citing as his reason a need to withdraw from public life and to devote himself to private contemplation and prayer. The church board accepted his resignation with expressions of understanding and sympathy, recognizing perhaps that his continued presence would serve only as a constant reminder of the tragedy that had befallen his family and the village. He took up residence in a small cottage in a distant market town, where he lived quietly until his death 4 years later, having apparently spent his final years in a kind of penitential solitude that his faith did not permit him to abandon. The village itself seemed to contract following these events, as though the revelations of violence and deception had altered its capacity for the kind of communal cohesion that had previously characterized it. The Women's Institute continued to meet, but with a smaller and more subdued membership. The annual garden party was not held that summer, and there was quiet discussion about whether such events might be discontinued permanently, as though the blood that had been spilled in the vicarage had contaminated the entire edifice of village social life. Miss Marple observed these changes with the patient attention that had characterized her throughout the entire sequence of events, but she seemed to withdraw somewhat from the active observation that had previously been her customary mode of engagement with village affairs. She received fewer visitors, declined more invitations than she accepted, and seemed to spend increasing amounts of time in solitude within her cottage, her knitting needles clicking with the mechanical rhythm of habit rather than the purposeful engagement with which she had previously pursued that occupation. It was during this period of withdrawal that she received a letter from Timothy Ashford, forwarded through several intermediaries, that would prove to be a final turn in the complex spiral of events that had begun with Margaret Hartley's death. The letter was composed with a formality that suggested Timothy had labored considerable effort in its composition, and it expressed his awareness of Miss Marple's role in both his conviction and his eventual exoneration. Timothy did not offer forgiveness, a word which he seemed to regard as inappropriate to the magnitude of what had occurred, but neither did he express bitterness or recrimination. Instead, he offered something closer to an acknowledgment that Miss Marple, like himself, had been trapped within a circumstance that had unfolded with a logic that transcended individual intention or control. He had been imprisoned for a crime he had not committed, but in the months of his imprisonment he had been forced to confront aspects of his own character that he might otherwise have continued to evade. His fraudulent credentials, his willingness to deceive those who had trusted him, his participation in schemes that had harmed innocent people. All of these were genuine failings that had created the circumstance in which murder had become possible. His own conviction, though unjust, had provided an opportunity for a kind of reckoning that freedom might not have afforded. He did not suggest that his punishment had been deserved, but he acknowledged that his experience, however unjustly imposed, had resulted in a kind of moral clarification that he might not otherwise have achieved. The letter concluded with a statement that Timothy had begun a new life in a new place, and that while he could not forgive those who had wronged him, he could acknowledge that they had not acted from malice, but from the inevitable human tendency to perceive evidence in a manner consistent with pre-existing assumptions and fears. Miss Marple held Timothy's letter in her hands for a long time after reading it, allowing the weight of his words to settle upon her consciousness, with the kind of gravitational force that seemed to pull her toward a reckoning with aspects of her own conduct that she had previously been able to compartmentalize or minimize. She sat in her parlor with the spring afternoon light filtering through the windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted with apparent aimlessness yet possessed their own invisible trajectories, and she found herself contemplating the manner in which human actions, like those dust particles, moved through the world according to laws that transcended individual intention or understanding. She had prided herself for 73 years on her capacity to perceive patterns in human behavior, to observe and interpret the signs that revealed truth beneath the surface of appearance. Yet that very capacity had been instrumental in directing a miscarriage of justice that had consumed months of an innocent man's life and had contributed to the death of a woman whose only significant failing had been her connection to that innocent man. The letter from Timothy, composed with a generosity of spirit that she felt she did not deserve, suggested that he understood something that Miss Marple was only beginning to grasp, that the pursuit of truth, while noble in its intention, could become corrupted by the human tendency to see in evidence confirmation of what one already believed to be true. She had observed certain details at the garden party, and in the days following the murder that had seemed to point toward Timothy's guilt, and she had allowed those observations to crystallize into conviction without subjecting that conviction to the kind of rigorous skepticism that ought to have attended the formation of judgments that would profoundly affect other human beings' lives. She had become so convinced of her own perceptiveness that she had failed to consider the possibility that she might be perceiving an illusion rather than a truth, that the patterns she observed might be artifacts of her own expectations rather than objective features of reality. This recognition brought with it a painful humility that seemed to diminish her sense of her own capacities in a way that decades of living had not accomplished. She wrote a response to Timothy's letter, though she struggled considerably with what to say and how to say it. She could not offer forgiveness because she did not believe that Timothy had wronged her in any manner that required such absolution. She could acknowledge her error in directing the initial investigation toward him, but such acknowledgment seemed to Miss Marple both obvious and inadequate to the magnitude of what had occurred. Instead, she wrote to Timothy about the nature of observation and judgment, about the manner in which human beings constructed narratives that seemed to explain the world, but which frequently obscured rather than clarified reality. She wrote about the particular danger that came from possessing a reputation for wisdom, because such a reputation encouraged both oneself and others to grant one's judgments a credibility that they did not necessarily merit. She wrote about the humility that ought to attend any intervention in the affairs of others, and the recognition that one's understanding of events was always partial and provisional, subject to revision as new information emerged or as one's own perspective shifted. The letter was lengthy and somewhat rambling, composed over several days, as Miss Marple attempted to articulate thoughts that seemed to resist clear articulation, and when she finally completed it, she was uncertain whether it communicated anything of value or whether it was merely another inadequate attempt to impose meaning upon events that transcended individual comprehension or control. She sent the letter nonetheless, trusting that Timothy would understand her intent, even if her words fell short of adequate expression. In the weeks following her correspondence with Timothy, Miss Marple found herself engaging with the village in a manner that was subtly but perceptibly different from her previous mode of interaction. She remained observant, for observation was so fundamental to her nature that to cease observing would have been to cease being herself in any meaningful sense. Yet she became more cautious about the conclusions she drew from her observations, and she seemed to regard her own interpretations of human behavior with a kind of friendly skepticism that suggested she no longer entirely trusted her own perceptiveness. When Mrs. Blackwell reported having observed something that seemed to indicate impropriety on the part of one of the village's younger residents, Miss Marple listened carefully, but offered no judgment regarding the significance of what had been observed. Hen Dr. Pemberton hinted at concern regarding his wife's health, in a manner that seemed to invite speculation about alternative explanations for her symptoms. Miss Marple responded with careful neutrality that offered no encouragement for such speculation. This new restraint did not make her less perceptive, but rather seemed to render her perceptiveness into something closer to wisdom, a recognition that seeing clearly and judging wisely were not identical capacities, and that the former did not necessarily lead to the latter. Inspector Graves visited her in May, bringing with him news that Timothy had written to the Home Office requesting that consideration be given to reviewing the procedures by which wrongful convictions might be prevented in the future. Timothy had suggested that the case of his own imprisonment demonstrated the manner in which initial investigative assumptions could become self-reinforcing, leading toward conclusions that seemed supported by evidence but which were actually artifacts of those same initial assumptions. He had suggested specific reforms in investigative procedure, checks and balances that might serve to prevent a similar miscarriage of justice from occurring in other cases. The inspector reported this information to Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he regarded Timothy's constructive response to injustice as somehow redemptive, though Miss Marple observed that redemption seemed to be occurring more thoroughly in Timothy's own understanding of himself and his circumstances than in any external transformation of the systems that had wronged him. The inspector also reported that his own superiors had indicated that the case would serve as a teaching example in investigative training, that the manner in which initial assumptions had corrupted the investigation would be presented to future generations of police officers as a cautionary tale regarding the importance of skepticism and the dangers of allowing evidence to be shaped by pre-existing conviction. Miss Marple listened to this information with the knowledge that such lessons were invariably learned incompletely, that human beings possessed an infinite capacity for believing that the mistakes made by others would not be replicated by themselves, and that the structural problems that had enabled Timothy's wrongful conviction would persist in modified form, waiting for circumstances to activate them once again. The summer following the trial of Christopher Hartley brought with it a kind of tentative restoration to Thornfield Village, though the restoration was tempered by an awareness that certain ruptures, once opened, could not be entirely sealed. The gardens bloomed with their customary profusion, the church services continued with a new vicar who carried none of the complicated history that had burdened Reverend Hartley, and the social rituals of village life resumed their familiar patterns. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the collective consciousness of the community, a recognition that the violence which had erupted within the vicarage had not been an aberration introduced from without, but rather had emerged from within the village itself, from among people whom everyone knew and had regarded with the comfortable assumption that such darkness could not exist in their midst. Miss Marple observed this gradual restoration with the patience of someone who understood that communities, like individuals, required time to integrate traumatic experience into their ongoing narrative of self-understanding. She noticed how people seemed to avoid discussing the events of the preceding months directly, preferring instead to allow those events to fade gradually into the background of collective memory, becoming part of the village's his. Tory, but not remaining present in its daily consciousness. This process seemed to Miss Marple both natural and somewhat evasive, a recognition that human beings possessed a necessary capacity for forgetting that allowed them to move forward without being permanently paralyzed by the weight of past tragedy. In late June, Miss Marple received a visitor whom she had not anticipated, though upon reflection she recognized that his arrival represented a logical conclusion to the sequence of events that had begun with Margaret Hartley's death. Christopher Hartley appeared at her cottage door on an afternoon when the light had taken on that particular quality of English summer that seemed to exist, suspended between day and approaching dusk. He had been released from prison on appeal, an outcome that had resulted from the legal arguments regarding the manner in which Timothy's wrongful conviction had tainted his own trial and the evidence that had been presented against him. The grounds for his release were technical rather than substantive, pertaining to procedural errors in the investigation and trial process rather than to any question regarding his actual guilt, which remained legally and factually incontrovertible. Christopher was not a free man in the sense that an innocent person who had been wrongfully convicted might be, but rather a man whose legal conviction had been invalidated through mechanisms of legal process, leaving him in a liminal space between guilt and freedom. He had come to speak with Miss Marple because, he explained, he believed she was one of the few people in the village who might understand the particular torment of existing in such a space, neither entirely condemned nor entirely exonerated, carrying the knowledge of one's own guilt while being denied the closure that a completed sentence might provide. Miss Marple invited him into her parlor, and they sat together in an atmosphere of considerable discomfort, though the discomfort seemed to Miss Marple to carry within it the potential for a kind of genuine understanding that more comfortable interactions could not accomplish. Christopher explained that he had been attempting to construct a new life in the aftermath of his release, that he had found employment in a distant town under circumstances that did not require him to disclose his history, and that he had established a kind of precarious stability that might allow him eventually to become a different version of himself than the young man who had murdered his mother in a moment of desperate panic. Yet he acknowledged that this new life was built upon the foundation of concealment and deception, that he was living in a manner that required him to hide fundamental aspects of who he was and what he had done, and that such a life, while survivable, seemed to him to be fundamentally incomplete. He had come to Miss Marple because he believed she could help him understand whether such a life was the only possibility available to him, whether redemption of any meaningful sort could be possible for someone who had committed the act he had committed and had subsequently chosen to allow an innocent man to be imprisoned for that act. Miss Marple listened to this confession with an expression that combined judgment and compassion in proportions that seemed difficult to specify, and when she finally spoke, her words seemed to emerge from the accumulated wisdom of decades of observation of human nature in its infinite complexity. She told him that redemption was perhaps not the appropriate framework within which to understand what he was attempting to accomplish. Redemption suggested a restoration to a previous state of innocence or virtue, and for someone who had committed murder and had chosen complicity in injustice, such restoration was not possible and ought not to be sought. What might be possible instead was the creation of a life that acknowledged the full weight of what he had done, that did not attempt to escape or minimize the consequences of his actions, and that attempted to contribute something of value to the world despite the fundamental corruption that his conduct had revealed within himself. She told him that such a life would necessarily involve a kind of ongoing discomfort, a refusal of the kind of peace that came from successful self-deception, and an acceptance of the fact that he would never be able to regard himself without confronting the knowledge of what he had done. Yet such a life, while far from redemptive, might possess a kind of integrity that a life built upon concealment could not achieve. Christopher departed from her cottage with an expression that suggested her words had been received not as comfort, but as a kind of stern recognition that he was capable of bearing the weight of his own conduct if he chose to do so. Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor as the summer evening deepened around her, her needles clicking with their familiar rhythm, and she allowed herself the acknowledgement that the mystery of Margaret Hartley's death had been solved not when Christopher's guilt had been established, but rather at this moment of genuine confrontation with the nature of consequence and responsibility. The village of Thornfield settled into its evening routines, the lights appearing in cottage windows, the evening birds calling across gardens and fields, and Miss Marple reflected upon the particular sadness that attended the observation of human nature, the recognition that people were capable of extraordinary complexity, and that the pursuit of truth about their conduct often illuminated not clarity, but rather an abyss of moral ambiguity that transcended simple categories of guilt and innocence. She had spent her life observing such truths, and she would continue to do so, carrying forward the burden of her perceptiveness with the quiet resignation of someone who understood that knowledge of human nature, while necessary, was never entirely bearable or comforting.